My name's Simon Locke. I'm a board member of the Foreign Press Association, also an entrepreneur and actually deeply involved in the content authentication space. So it gives me great pleasure today to be with Santiago Lyon. Santiago is the head of Advocacy and Education at the Content Authenticity Initiative. But he actually has a very interesting background. Started your career, I believe, as a war photographer. So maybe we can start with, what's been the trajectory of your career? How do you go from war photographer to heading up or leading an alliance around this new technology?
Well, thanks, Simon. It's really all the same thing to some degree. Journalism is all about transparency and authenticity, and the work that we're doing around digital content provenance is also about those things. My career has been long and varied and rich and fruitful in the sense that I was a photographer in the field for 20 years, a decade of which I spent photographing war and conflict around the world. I photographed 9 wars on 4 continents. I was captured by Saddam Hussein's army at the end of the first Gulf War. I was wounded in Bosnia. I lost a lot of friends and colleagues to violent deaths in the service of journalism. And so my commitment to those values of authenticity and transparency were very strong. Subsequently, I became a vice president in charge of photography for the Associated Press, running the global photo department, overseeing 1,000 photographers, putting out 1 million images a year with very strict ethical and journalistic standards. And so when I had the opportunity 5 years ago or so to join the Content Authenticity Initiative team here at Adobe, it seemed like a completely natural fit. It seemed like I was just carrying on my life's work in journalism with those same values, albeit through the perspective of a technology company and one that is working on open source technology that will benefit everybody and is in essence a safety tool to help make the internet a safer place.
Well, I think that's a great point to sort of build on a little bit in terms of, the world has changed very significantly, right? From the time you started your career as a war photographer, I assume you were using film, um, and to the world in which we are today, in which we've got um, increasingly, because of these questions about trust and authenticity, these questions about, is this photograph real? Is this something that has been manipulated? Is it from where it says it is from? And there are so many examples in recent history where we are seeing images and people seem to and believe them, right? Because you go, well, that seems to be right, but they are proving to be fakes or deep fakes. How would how do you sort of think about, from your standpoint, you know, the change from, let's say, film, not impossible to manipulate, but hard to manipulate, to the world in which we are today?
Yeah, it's been a remarkable transition. I mean, when I started out in this industry, in the news media industry in the mid 1980s, we were developing film, we were making 8 by 10 prints, we were then sending those images down telephone lines, where at the other end they would be turned back into images again. Each black and white picture took 15 minutes. We traveled around the world with portable darkrooms that we would set up in the bathrooms of our hotel rooms. I mean, it was a very sort of artisanal process. And the opportunities then, or the ability to manipulate imagery was very different. Not to say it couldn't happen. It certainly could happen in the darkroom, and on occasion it did happen, but it was quite labor intensive. When we got to the sort of, mid to late 1990s with the advent of digital photography and the ability to transmit images much faster, what you saw was an exponential increase in the number of images that news agencies and consumer-facing news media outlets were providing. It went from being, sort of 100 a day to 3,000 a day from each of those news media outlets. So it was an exponential increase. And then, of course, with the advent of the internet and with social media companies, those numbers just ballooned, and you had this sort of mix of imagery from legitimate news sources with high standards combined with images from social media distributed by social media companies, produced by people who had their own smartphones and all of that. And so really what's happened is that we are certainly in the world of imagery, photos and video, we're drowning in it. There's so much of it, and the consumption patterns have changed. You know, it used to be a paper-based environment, and it used to be fairly slow-paced compared with it is today. Now it's instantaneous. Everybody's looking at stuff all the time, primarily on smartphones, and they're sort of glancing and swiping, and then of course you add to that the sort of politicization of imagery and the use of imagery for political purposes or to amplify certain messages and all of that. And it becomes really confusing. I'm supposed to be an expert in this stuff, and I'm often shaking my head, asking myself, okay, what is that? Where did that come from? What's the message? How was it created? And then, of course, to that, you add, AI and generative AI in particular, which has come about over the last 3 or 4 years. And an already confusing landscape suddenly becomes even more confusing because the barriers for entry are quite low, and the sort of democratization of the ability to create completely synthetic artificial content with a few keystrokes, and not only that, but to have it look hyper realistic is just mind blowing. And so, the stuff that we're working on in the Content Authenticity Initiative is all about providing more information and more transparency into helping people navigate this world and have a better understanding of what they're looking at.
It's was there a moment in your career or a moment that you look back and say, this was the kind of moment in time with your, journalistic experience, with your photojournalistic experience, that you said, wow, this is the moment when we actually have to start to think differently? Is there some kind of experiences that you've had that you would go, these were the pivotal moments, these were the pivotal either images or experiences that said, this has got to change?
Yeah, there was a moment a few years ago, and it's appropriate that I would confess this because the moment is of that picture of the Pope wearing a puffy white coat that made the rounds a couple of years ago. I saw that image online, and at first I was like, "Huh, no way." And then I thought, well, why not? He's a progressive Pope. He's in the Vatican. Italy's a fashion center. It's not out of the question that the Pope would wear something like that. And for a moment, I believed it. I thought, sure. And then, as it was analyzed on the internet and as people began to look at it, and the creator came out and said, yeah, I made this in my basement one day, it became obvious that it was a completely artificial image. When I saw that, I was like, wow, okay. Now if we had to pay attention before, we really have to pay attention now. And so that moment, I think for me was super important because it really highlighted the ease with which anybody could create misleading content like that. And I kept asking myself, or I kept telling myself, wow, if you were fooled, meaning me as a erstwhile expert in this, imagine how the proverbial Kansas City milkman, as defined by the news agencies of old, would react to an image like that, right? The ordinary person on the street who doesn't have the journalistic or to the degree that I do, technical background. So I think that was an important moment for me. But prior to that, when I was running the AP's photo department, we were routinely receiving images from places that had different standards. So, for example, we were receiving images from the North Korean government. And I remember there was an image there of one of the North Korean leaders, I think it was Kim Jong-un, sitting at his desk, and above his hand was a cloud of smoke. And we were like, well, where's the smoke coming from? And then we realized that in the original picture, he was holding a cigarette. But the Korean government didn't like that look, or somebody didn't like that look, so they photoshopped it or manipulated it out. But they forgot about the smoke. And so we were like, oh, okay. So things like that. So it's not, the history of image manipulation is long. It's been going on since the 1880s, famous portraits of Abraham Lincoln that were actually his head on somebody else's body, or the Soviets removing people who fell out of political favor. But that was all quite manual and labor intensive. I think the first big moment of digital manipulation was when National Geographic decided to move the pyramids from a horizontal photograph shot by one of their photographers. They wanted to compress it into a vertical photograph for the cover of their magazine. And so they used nascent, I think it was called Cytex technology, to move the pyramid over to create a vertical image. And they did that without the knowledge of the photographer. And then when it came to light, it created a bit of an uproar. And then subsequently, there have been myriad cases. So it's not that this is anything new, but I think what's happened is that because of the developments in technology, it's made the ability to manipulate things that much easier, that much simpler. And as a result, you're seeing stuff all over the place, particularly in video. Video used to be the sort of acid test because it was too difficult to manipulate. And I remember going to a technology conference a couple of years ago, and a data scientist was up there saying, those days are over. Look, video is easy to manipulate. And since then, of course, we've seen text to video generation, and it's true. So with that, it's like, wow, what do we do?
Yeah, actually, I was talking to a congressman fairly recently, and he was saying to me, I saw Amy Klobuchar actually saying some things that I thought were a little strange. I've never heard her say stuff like that before, and I had to check with my staff, and they said yes, deep fake. And it goes to show that I think there is a behavioral element to all of this stuff, right? Which is, I think you said as we were talking about the Pope in the white puffy jacket, these things seem to work most strongly when they are closest to, that seems like it could be real. That looks like it could be real. And then behaviorally, you're more likely to go, well, that makes sense. Should people today be checking that impulse? Because that is being used to manipulate, right? It is social engineering designed to go, that could be true, but today people have got to like take one step back and go, is it really true?
Yeah, I mean, I think one component of this is emotion. By playing to people's emotions or things that they believe in and care about. There were some pictures making the rounds last year purporting to show a little girl in a canoe who'd been rescued from a flood in North Carolina, and she was holding a puppy in her hands. And, just the emotional strength of the image, even though it was completely artificial, people could, you know, emote or feel empathy towards the little girl or the puppy. And what happened was it sort of overrode their better instinct about that image. And I think that's something that you see all the time. And then, of course, the other thing is that sometimes it's about affirming people's views. If they see something that's in line with what they believe about something, well, they're more likely to give it a pass because why wouldn't they believe it? Because they believe the issue at hand or the perspective at hand. So there's all those sorts of things. I think what's been lost to some degree, you know, I grew up, and you probably did too, during the sort of Cold War, where, there was a sort of an ideological clash. And one of the results of that was that certainly I was taught to question the source. Who's putting this out? Where does this come from? Where does the money come from? Looking at the beginnings of books, of publishers, and all of those sorts of things. I fear that over the years that's been lost a little bit. That sort of skepticism and that exacting nature has been lost a little bit. Partly because, as I mentioned, we're completely drowning in content, visual and otherwise, and so it becomes a little bit overwhelming. And also partly because of the educational aspect of all of this, right? We talk about the technology and the provenance and all of that, and that's certainly very important. But when you look at the media literacy landscape for young people around the world, it's really distressingly sparse in terms of how media literacy is taught and to what degree it's taught. In a couple of countries, it's taught pretty well. Finland, for example, is sort of recognized as the leaders in the space because they have Russia as a neighbor and they're being bombarded with mis and disinformation all the time. But after that, there are a few countries who, make a reasonably good faith effort. But the majority of countries, it's not on the curriculum. It's not in the syllabus. And so as a result, you have whole generations of young people who are at a loss to how to navigate this because they've never been taught the skills required to do that. And I think that's highly problematic and difficult. And I would say there's a huge opportunity for educational authorities and governments around the world to up their game in terms of teaching media literacy to young people.
Well, there's no doubt one of the things that we are seeing a lot of right now is attention being paid to sort of detection when and rising concern, I think, about trust in the digital landscape in general as a result of when you see a fraud, when you see a deep fake, I think people question then, well, can I trust this other thing? And that is pretty a pretty fundamental erosion of the foundation for kind of everything in the digital landscape. When you're working and leading the way in terms of the adoption of content authentication, and I think this is obviously this is a technology that you've been working on for 5 years, or the group's been working on for 5 years. Uh, but it seems to have met its moment. It seems to be a time when the issues are now so significant that people are actually paying a lot of attention. What they may not know is how it actually works. I think it's worth kind of taking a few minutes to kind of give a sense of how does this build trust into content that people receive? Why is this
Yeah,
an important technology?
yeah, I think you're right with it. This is the critical moment now because of all of these things coming together, technology, social media, politicization, all these things conspiring, if you like. And so when we look at that landscape, which we did when we got going on this work 5 years ago, we sort of identified four important pillars. The first one is the obvious one that everybody would love to work, which is the area of detection, where you upload a suspect file to a program that looks for telltale signs of manipulation. And certainly detection on an ad hoc basis can be useful. The issue with detection is that at its very best, it achieves about 98% accuracy, which sounds like a great number until you understand that that missing 2% could account for very important images or large amounts of very important images. It's also invariably an arms race with bad actors trying to stay one step ahead of the detection software, and it's not scalable because it just takes a little bit too long. So detection is certainly useful, and we work closely with many partners in the detection space. But what we're really focused on is the area of provenance, understanding the origins of a digital file. Where did it come from? How it might have been manipulated from the moment of creation through editing and then on to publication, and then sharing some or all of that information with the viewer through what we might call a digital nutrition label, where they can interact with the image through an icon or through the display of the underlying information and see where did it come from? How was it changed? And we've been working very hard to accelerate implementation of something called a content credential, which comes from an underlying standards organization that Adobe helped to set up a few years ago, together with Microsoft and the BBC and Intel and TruePic and others. Um, an open source technical standard living within the Linux Foundation, which means that the C2PA, the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity that develops the technical standard, is unencumbered by IP. Nobody owns it. Anybody can use it. And that's great because it means that users aren't beholden to one technology company or another. So the work that we're doing in the Content Authenticity Initiative is all about accelerating implementation of that C2PA technical standard. And that's great. And we've made good progress and we continue to make good progress. However, it's very important to note that the technology is only likely to get us so far. And so there are two other very important pillars that we also spend a lot of time working on. One is the pillar of legislation and policy, because what we're seeing around the world is legislation being introduced and codified that is going to mandate some level of transparency around the use of AI or just general provenance writ large. And so we spend a lot of time making sure that those lawmakers and policymakers have a deep understanding of all the nuances and possibilities so that they can craft sensible legislation that will actually work and be meaningful. And then the third area that we spend a lot of time on is the area of education. Media literacy, as I mentioned before, where there's a lot of opportunity. But then beyond that, societal education. As we see C2PA, content credential technology, becoming more ubiquitous, it's going to be important to alert society to the fact that it's there and how does it work. And then lastly, the notion of consumer education. Dear viewer of the BBC or dear reader of the Daily Bugle, here's what this means, here's how to interpret it, etc. So we really see it as a trifecta of provenance, education, and policy. And those three things together with detection as an adjacency, I think are the way forward.
It's one of the things we've certainly been thinking about, and this is with my technology hat on and for Tauth, that what we're talking about in terms of the ability to frame content authentication as part of a range of solutions, like the multi-layered solution. I think within the technology itself, you've got almost like a dollar bill, right? You've got different layers of provenance built in, different protections built into it. But at the same time, in the implementation, we've got the protects component of knowing provenance. We've got the detect idea of trying to identify this stuff, and then there's the solution of, well, what do you do to kind of correct this? Content authentication offers, to some extent, I think, the path to solve almost all of these problems. Right? It's not it's there are components to it, but how do you see the multi-dimensional nature of content authentication sort of working in practice?
Yeah, so we divide the work up into three main buckets. We start with capture or creation. So we're working very closely with many of the world's leading hardware manufacturers, both cameras and smartphones, and generative AI companies, um, to understand the genesis or the origin of the file. Where did the file came from? What device created it, or what AI model created it? And embedding the content credential from the C2PA into the file at that moment, whether it's photo, audio, video, 3D, even text now, it's becoming possible. And so that's where the journey begins. The next bucket that we look at or area that we look at is the area of editing. What changes are made during the editing process? Was something light and darkened? Was somebody removed, etc.? And that is already embedded into a number of major editing programs, Adobe Plus, Capture One, and Photo Mechanic, and a whole host of others. And that's quite useful as well. And then the third area is the area of publication. When the file or the image gets published online, we're working with the content management system providers to maintain the integrity of the content credential from creation through editing and onto publication so that the user has an interactive experience or can have an interactive experience. And by clicking on a little icon, open up and see where did this actually come from. And so that's how we're thinking about it, for the actual viewer to be useful. And in each of those areas, we've made a huge amount of progress. There's still a ways to go because the technology, of course, is not simple. It's quite complex. But as we work to make it more accessible and easier, which is what the Content Authenticity Initiative does. In other words, we're focused on accelerating implementation of this C2PA content credential. And so we do that three different ways. We build open source tools to help developers implement. Those sit on GitHub. We run a very vibrant Discord channel to answer questions. That's underway and quite fruitful. The second thing, of course, we do is productize this in Adobe products, but of course in other products as well because of the open source nature. So we work closely with other vendors to help them get there. And then the third thing we do is tell the story. That's the area that I oversee, sort of highlighting progress, organizing events for people interested in this topic, community events, online, in real life, blog posts, videos, emails, all kinds of stuff. And so we're really focused on accelerating implementation and raising awareness because the goal when we try and define success, the word that we continually come back to is ubiquity. When content credentials are as ubiquitous as the nutrition label in the supermarket, then we will know that we've arrived. And people, if they're interested, will know that for files that they're curious about, there is the ability to have a deeper understanding of where they came from.
One of the things that we I often get asked, and we're certainly talking about media organizations, is, does everyone actually have to be using credentials or content authentication for it to be effective? And whenever I answer that question, it's like, well, no, the answer is actually it works very well for specific use cases, but the more it's adopted, it has a big system benefit. And one of the things I've seen some of the experts, and we have a growing community of people who are expert in this particular topic. You see a focus on not only the protection side of things, but also the ability of once people can trust what they're seeing, that has sort of economic benefits or trust benefits. Let's say, for a journalist audience, if the audience trusts that that image is authentic, that has benefits way beyond just sort of protecting people from that particular image, right?
Yeah, I mean, the use cases here are multiple. I mean, we've been working with, let's say, creators around attribution and potential protection from data scraping. We've been working with news media companies about bolstering the trust that's at the core of all journalism. We've been working with corporations around corporate reputation and consumer protection in a number of areas. We've been working in the law enforcement space because increasingly digital evidence is called into question during court proceedings, and the court has no way of knowing where a video or an image purporting to show somebody doing something actually came from. The insurance industry is interested in authenticating images that accompany insurance claims, the auditing industry. The archival space where, our historic memory is housed. How do we know that those images are not being repurposed for nefarious purposes? Satellite imagery, scientific imagery, official communications from public entities, governments around policy or around elections. And really, when you look at it from that perspective, you see that because what's essentially happened that you alluded to earlier is this erosion of trust, right? This cloud of doubt and uncertainty as a result of the proliferation of artificial intelligence. It's created a world where, for any industry where trust is a key component, and I would argue that's most industries, this need to say and to demonstrate, hey, you can now have a better understanding of what you're looking at. And I think what's going to happen in the next few years is people are going to look back and say, well, how did we ever live without these technologies? In the same way that we might look back and say, well, how did people ever live without seatbelts or bicycle helmets or whatever, right? And it takes time and it's a very heavy lift because it's not just a technological implementation, it's a societal change in the way people interact with information and the way people come to understand the veracity or the credibility of information. So there's a lot to do, but I feel like we're on the right path.
So I'm going to ask one last question, which would be with my as we think about journalism and the media in particular. So, given your experience as a photojournalist, do you think what advice would you give to any journalist, or what do you talk to media organizations about today, knowing that we've got this technology to build trust into content? Um, do you see is the adoption coming as fast as you would expect, as you would like? Is the media an early adopter? Where do you think the media is on this progression?
I think the media, is writ large is wrestling with some existential issues. around economic viability, subscribers, advertising, all of those things. That's nothing new. That's been going on for some time. But it's a combination of stressors. And so as a result of those, they've been somewhat distracted. We've been working very closely with the news media companies around the world, really under the auspices or through the good offices of the IPTC, the International Press and Telecommunications Council, which is an organization that's been around for more than 50 years, focused on helping media players standardize metadata and things like that. And I think we're on the verge of seeing implementation in the news media space. News media companies struggle a little bit as to where this belongs. Like the journalists get very excited because it's an added layer of credibility that will vouch for their content, and they should be excited. However, journalists are not typically involved in procurement or in product. And so when we're talking to these news media companies, we're sort of talking to them at two different levels. One at the implementation level with their metadata experts and their technology experts, but really, as importantly, at the C-suite level, so that they can invest in making their products safer and more transparent, which I think is needed more and more every day as journalism is increasingly under attack or threat from a variety of actors. So I think we're on the verge of seeing some major implementations in the news media space. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but I think over the course of this year, we'll start to see some major action. And I think, like in any space, there are opportunities for leadership. There are opportunities to be at the cutting edge, the vanguard of this stuff, and to set the example and show others how it's being done. And we're seeing a little bit of that in lots of different spaces.
Santiago, thanks very much indeed. Very
Thank
much
you,
appreciate
Simon.
your time. Thank you.
Appreciate it.